It is July 21, 2023, and I am here with Carl Otto from Leroy, Kansas.
Right.
Welcome to the Eisenhower Foundation.
Good to be here.
So, can you give me the day you were born?
Abe Lincoln was born on my birthday, February 12th, 1926. So that makes me 97 years old. I'm pushing 98.
You are. And where were you born?
Pierce, Nebraska. And I was raised mainly in Norfolk, Nebraska. Me and Johnny Carson.
That's right.
Johnny and I were the same age. We were kids together.
Did you know him?
He was from Norfolk.
Well, it's not that big a town, I guess.
Yeah. I suppose it's about the same size of Abilene.
And what did your parents do?
My dad was an automobile mechanic and a diesel mechanic later on. Mom was a housewife, mainly. She was a registered hillbilly and a quarter Cherokee Indian, and she was proud of it.
That's great.
Yeah.
And did you go to school there in Norfolk, graduate high school?
I'm a high school dropout. I'm a high school dropout, and I ended my career, my last 15 years, I was superintendent of a unified school district.
It's ironic.
Okay. Say how you were a high school dropout. How were you? Why?
Well, I was afraid the war was going to get over before I got into it. I took a test, an aptitude test, to be a Navy fighter pilot. And in fact, the guy came to the school and he gave one. I was a junior. I dropped out and then started. But since I was 17 years old, they let me take it with the senior boys. And 4 of us passed it. And I was one of them. And so the next day we were supposed to go down to Independence, Kansas to take a physical. And then as soon as school was out, we were to start flight training. But since I was 17 years old, I had to have parental permission. So I had a form to fill out. My mother would not sign the form. She said, I know how reckless you are, and you don't have any business flying an airplane. And I was terribly disappointed. And also I was ignorant. I didn't realize that I could join the Navy at 17. I wanted to be in the Navy. But I thought you had to be 18 because the draft was 18. So I went right down to the draft board and told them I wanted to be called on my birthday just as soon as I could. And they accommodated me. I got my notice on my birthday.
So you were drafted in?
So I was drafted. Then when I got up there, they said, do you want to be in the Army, the Navy, or the Marines? I said, I'd like to be in the Navy. Why do you want to be in the Navy? Because I think I'd be a better sailor than that soldier. He stamped it. He says, you're in the Army.
Well,
And so I was in the Army.
Well, shoot.
That's how come I ended up with Paul.
So where was basic training?
Camp Maxey, Texas.
Well, that's a good place, I guess, as any.
Yeah, I had 6 weeks of basic training at Camp Maxey, Texas, And that is all the military training I ever had.
Wow.
I never had another day of military training. But I ended up being an automobile mechanic, a truck driver, and then a pole climber in the Signal Corps, all during the, well, I was about 120 days of combat, something like that, when I was working with Paul. And then I went back in the Army of Occupation,
Before
and
you
here
go,
I am, a high school dropout. And what do? They make me Director of Information and Education and Post Librarian at Frankfurt, Germany. Well, I found out why they put me in the Information and Education office, because we didn't have any business. I had one soldier inquire about an extension class during the time I was there,
Everyone was
and he
busy.
was the only one.
So when you got out of basic training,
Yeah. Oh yeah, I did go down to Camp Crowder from Maxie, Texas. We went to Camp Crowder, and most of the guys took training in the pole climb in the Signal Corps. But since my dad was a mechanic, and I had that on my record, I didn't need any training. They just put me in the motor pool.
so after basics, you were stationed in Europe.
My what?
After basic training, you were stationed.
Yes,
in,
then after basic training, we went to Camp Crowder for a while. Then we went to England. We went overseas on the Queen Mary. And we went to Scotland. They just anchored in a bay off Scotland, and then they shuttled us in on little boats. And from there we went to Leicester, England. And I was at Leicester when the Battle of the Bulge started.
So this was in 1944.
That was in December
December
1944. And so they needed infantry replacements, and I volunteered to be an infantry replacement. And, of course, within a few days, I was on a landing barge headed for Europe. And what also we didn't know, but we were headed into one of the worst blizzards that had ever hit Europe, and in years. And Hitler knew that too, and that's the reason he started the Battle of the Bulge. He knew that weather was going to be tough, and the German troops were better. Their clothing was better, their boots were better.
So where did you?
Well, I went in as an infantry replacement, and I was put in an infantry squad for a period of time. And when one day this sergeant said for me and another guy, he said, go with this guy. Now, where are we going? He said, doesn't make any difference, you're out of the infantry. And that's when I was assigned to the 94th Signal Battalion, and Paul Curbs was my sergeant, the guy from Abilene here. And
So did you see any combat when you were at the Battle of the Bulge? While you were there?
well, yeah, everybody did.
Everybody did.
Now, I didn't fire a shot,
That's fine.
and the reason I didn't was because this grizzly old sergeant that went down the line of volunteers, he said, you. He picked out the 8 or 9 youngest faces, and he says, okay, now you glory-hungry little bastards, you are going to do exactly what I tell you. You are not going to step out of line 1 inch. You won't take a leak without asking me. And if you do step out of line, I'll shoot you in the foot and you'll go home alive. He said, this is war. People get killed in war. And he made a believer out of me. So I stuck with him, and I was with his squad maybe 10 days, I don't know. It was so cold that there wasn't much going on. There was artillery coming in, breaking limbs off, falling, and like that, but I wasn't in any position to shoot at anything while I was with this infantry squad, but I was just, afraid I might get a little shrapnel or a machine gun round. But anyway, then I go to the 94 Signal Battalion, and I come right back in the same area. Never left the area. I wasn't a mile from where I was with the infantry squad.
And so what was your job?
And Paul Curbs, I guess he thought that he was going to take me under his arm and make sure I got through okay. Because I was with him most of the time. And I got to where I just loved him. He was like my older brother.
What was your job when you were with the Signal Battalion?
My main job was making overheads, we called them. Keeping the wires up off the ground so the tanks and the trucks wouldn't run over them. We laid communication lines. The main communication line we laid were these rubber covered things, and you just plug them together and give them a twist, and you had a line, and there was 4 wires in them, and they were 1/4 of a mile long. And we would lay them on the ground, but when we came to some place where we had to go over the roads, well, then we had to make an overhead. And I could climb a tree like a squirrel, and so I wore my climbers all the time. Some days I'd go days without taking my climbers off.
What were your climbers? Explain that.
And there's just a pair of hooks on the steel strap that came up and fastened on your leg, and it had a spur on it. And you could just dig it into a tree, and I could just run up a tree like a...
So you went up the pole and put the wire
I go
up?
up poles too. And so that was my main job, laying those lines.
Important to have communication to get between...
One time, Paul and I, the only time we ever laid it where it wasn't on the road was we went back to get some supplies, and Paul ran into another sergeant that was with a different squad. I guess he was with the 94th, but he was not with, I didn't know him. And he said that we'd had a line cut with artillery, and he needed to run another 1/4 mile down this railroad track. And he said he wanted it put up along next to the rail so the artillery couldn't get to it as much. So Paul said, yeah, we'll help you. So he put the reel on the Jeep, and he took out down the track, and Paul and I came along behind. We were making sure the wire was up against the track, but nobody ever took a shot at us, nothing. But there was a possibility that it could have happened. So we laid that 1/4 mile. And then another time, we came onto a bridge that had been blown. Half of it was in the water. And Paul said, well, looks like we're going to have to go down to a pontoon bridge. It's about 7 miles down to a pontoon bridge to get across this river. I don't know what river it was. And I said, well, why don't we put it across this bridge? And he says, how are we going to put it across this bridge? The bridge is down in the water, and there's holes in the bridge. You can't walk across it. I said, well, I can climb up on that railing. I'll climb up the railing and pull the wire across on top of the railing. He says, oh, you can't climb that railing. I just took my spurs off and went up that thing like a squirrel again. It had rivets that big around that stuck out that far. I could get a hold of them.
Put your toes on there and your hands.
It was about that wide. It was solid steel. Paul said, set up the reel and toss Chick the end of it. And so they did. Then they went down to the pontoon bridge, went across and come back and came up to the other side of the bridge. In the meantime, I crawled down the span and pulling the wire after me. And I got down there, and of course I had to wait. It took them longer to do it. I'm sitting out there on that bridge. It's at an angle about like this, and the water was rushing underneath it. I could hear the water. And pretty soon that old bridge went, it just settled about 6 inches. And I just about bailed out. But it washed the gravel out, but at the end of it, it settled down a little bit. And then, of course, when they got there, I had the wire. I tied it in a knot. And then I pulled up a bunch of it and made it sort of like a lariat rope so I could give it a swing like this. Paul caught it on the first toss. That was what he was going to... He told me he was going to recommend me for the Bronze Star for that. And I said, I don't want any Bronze Star for that. And so my service record shows Bronze Star with a line drawn through it.
Well, communication was very important. That's kept the war going forward.
Well, it saved a lot of time and a lot of wire. We would have had to lay 7 miles of wire down to that pontoon bridge and then across and then back.
That was a big help. So, going back, do you know what day that you joined the Army? Do you know what day that was?
Did I what now?
Do you know what day you
What day I joined? Well, I got my notice on my birthday, but I don't remember the day that I went. It says on my service record, but I forget.
So it was in February, probably?
Well, it was, no, I believe it was more like March.
Okay.
But anyway.
In 19...
And then I was at Fort Leavenworth for a while, and while I was there, they taught us some military drill and...
Sure. So was that in 43 or 44 when you
44.
Went? 44?
Yeah, that was 44.
And so did you...
So it didn't take very long. From there, then I went into combat in December of 1944 at the Battle of the Bulge.
Did you stay in Europe for your whole time in the service?
Yeah, I was in Europe the whole time.
Okay.
And, well, we were scheduled, the 94th Battalion. I didn't realize the 94th Signal Battalion was a very elite outfit. It was a part of General Patton's Third Army. As Bill said, I was General Patton's telephone company. Anyway, after years later, I have a great grandson-in-law who is a career military, and he was stationed at Fort Gordon. And Fort Gordon is the Signal Corps, the main Signal Corps base for the United States Army. In fact, it still is, I guess. That's Fort Gordon, Georgia. They have a museum down there on the post, and we were down there, and I went into the museum. And I look in, I see a desk like this through an office, and there's a guy sitting at the desk, and I just walked over to the door and stuck my head in. He says, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Well, I was in the Signal Corps during World War II, and I just thought I'd come and take a look at this museum." He said, "What outfit were you with?" I said, "I was with the 94th Signal Band." "You were with the 94th?" He said. No, whoa, here. He says, "Wow, that was an elite outfit." Well, I do know that during the war, I never was with with the battalion. We were always on detached service. We were on detached service with the 101st Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, the 3rd Corps Artillery, the 9th Armored Division, and a few others I can't recall. We were always doing something like that. Well, have you heard of the Potsdam Conference? We set up the communications at the Potsdam Conference.
That's awesome.
I never worked so hard in my life as I did that day. We put a cable, what they called a 40 quat cable. It was a lead covered cable about this big around, and it had 400 telephone wires in it. And we had to string that from a big reel out at the edge of town, down into manholes, through the conduits to the building where the conference was being held. And then there was another unit from the 94th was there to setting up the switchboard. And that's what we did. And President Truman was there that day. I saw President Truman. Well, I saw his hat.
You knew it was him.
Because I'm only 5'6" at the time. Now I'm not that tall. But this 1941 Packard come driving up there, and I saw Harry Truman's hat get out, and he got up to the steps, and he took his hat off, and he went like this.
That's awesome.
And went in.
Did you ever have a chance to meet or see General Eisenhower?
I never did myself, but that one day, of course, he was always talking to troops. And we didn't know he was in town or anywhere near around there. I don't know where we were. I don't know what town it was. We were in a town. I don't know how big it was. But we were in a communication wire. And somebody says, Ike is down there. Ike in his Jeep. And then one of our guys said, "Hey, we got a guy here from Abilene."
Paul.
And Ike says, "Well, send him down." So Paul goes down there, and I got his belt, and went right behind him. And then we got down to the Jeep, and by then there's a bunch of guys gathered around the Jeep. I don't know what they were talking, anyway, they talked for a minute or two, but this colonel in the back seat was saying, "General, we got to get out of here. We're drawing quite a crowd. We got to keep moving." So pretty soon they left.
Did you peek around and see him?
I never did get to see him. They were too tight around the Jeep, and I was behind Paul, and I couldn't. So I might have got a little peek at him, but I didn't.
That's awesome.
But he was sitting in the passenger side, and there was a buck sergeant was driving the Jeep. They said.
So So when did
I
you?
did see the colonel that was in the back. I could see him because he stood up once.
When did you get out of the service?
Well, I got out in June, I think it was, in 46. And then I went 6 years in the reserves. 3 inches in. And I was a year in the Army of Occupation. That's when I was Information and Education Office for a while.
So how'd you get into education? Did you?
I went to Pittsburgh University.
Did you do use
Well,
the GI Bill?
actually,
Yes, yes.
I enrolled, I took a GED. Well, actually, I enrolled in high school. I was going to finish my high school. And my high school principal says I was going to apply for the GI Bill to go to high school. That they would have paid me. And when my principal saw this papers, he called me in the office and he says, "Don't waste your GI Bill on high school." He said, "To go take a GED and go to college." And I said, "Well, what's a GED?" And he told me, and so I went over to college, took the GED. Well, they gave me this thing, and I was supposed to go in and take an hour or two to do it, and I just went in and filled it out. And I don't know whether I passed it or not. I don't think they knew whether I passed it. They wanted GIs. The college did.
But college.
So I never knew what my grade was at Pittsburgh State. I went one semester. I got an A, a B, a C, a D, and I went through failing. And I quit. Then I met this little redhead. And after a while, we got talking about getting married. She said, "Well, there's only one condition. You've got to go back to college if we get married." I thought, well, hell, maybe she's worth it. So I did. And after I went a couple of semesters, I thought, well, heck, this is no problem. So,
And you became a teacher?
yeah, I was a teacher and a coach and a bus driver. And then I took over as a principal, high school principal, and I was also a teacher. Back then, the principals in a small school all taught. So I taught, and I was there 13 years at Elsinore. And
That's great.
then I ended up my last 15 years at Crest Unified School District at Kincaid and Colony, superintendent of schools.
That's wonderful. Do you feel like the military changed your life?
Well, oh yes, it did. For one thing, if it hadn't been for the GI Bill, I never would have gone to college. And that's true of so many guys. The GI Bill made a big difference on this whole country. Because guys like me that never would have gone to college, went to college, consequently we made more money, paid more income tax. So it paid off. The GI Bill really paid off. And I had 3 years credit.
That's great.
I think I had 29 and a half months of active service. But then I also went into the reserves. So they told me I had 3 years of GI Bill. And that was enough for me to get my degree.
That's great. Is there anything you would like to say, or a message you'd like to give to the next generation about World War II in your life?
Well, you know, there's always going to be wars because old men start them, and young men who are full of piss and vinegar, and they think they're invincible. They can't, like I was. I was scared the war was going to get over before I got into it. And so they're ready to go. And I think military training is great. I actually believe that every 18-year-old should take basic training, boys and girls. Well, his daughter, Julie, she wanted to be a doctor. So she joined the National Guard. And they were going to put her through medical school. And then they would have, but she decided against it. But anyway, she's 5 foot tall, weighed 100 pounds, I suppose. And she joined the National Guard, and she's going off to basic training. I thought, oh, God, those girls from the ghetto are going to eat her up. She came out of basic training tougher than a boot. And right now, I know she's a millionaire or more. She's got 2 businesses, and but the military did it for her. And I think the military was a big boost for me, too, even though I never got any training. I had some experiences that were worth it. Well, I tell about them in that little book. But war is hell. I don't care how you look at it, it's bad news. And I think about when we were going through the museum, I thought about how General Eisenhower must have thought when he was going back to Normandy and he was looking at all those white crosses. And how many boys, just kids, that got killed. How many thousand did we lose, Bill? 37,000, something like that.
Well, it's 250,000 during the whole war.
At Normandy. And I know that Eisenhower, that was heavy on him because he was the one that made the decision, but then that had to be done. Well, when the war ended in Europe, the 94th Signal Battalion was sent to Marseille, France, and we were scheduled to go to Japan and be on the invasion of Japan when the atomic bomb was dropped. And so that ended it. The 94th went home, and I had to go back to Germany because I didn't have enough points to go home.
I have something that you need to tell future generations. And it killed Ike before his time. Cigarettes, every K ration.
Oh yeah, the cigarette companies provided the cigarettes. For every box of K rations had 4 cigarettes in it. And it hooked I don't know how many guys on cigarettes. Of course, they probably would have been hooked anyway because the movies all smoked. Everybody was smoking, you know. They had the Marlboro Man who died of lung cancer.
It's before we knew what
They
it
all
did.
had to smoke.
Yeah.
But you never have, and you're 97.
No, I didn't.
Good job.
I give mine to other guys.
Well, Carl, thank you so much for talking with me today. Thank you for your service.
Well, Julie, isn't it Julie?
Lisa.
Lisa, yeah.
Thank you very
It's
much.
been a pleasure.